Jennifer is serving as the World Council of Churches Programme Executive for Human Rights and Disarmament. And in this role, she provides training, facilitates and supports the engagement of churches and ecumenical partners in the UN human rights system, and advocates for disarmament goals, particularly the prohibition of nuclear weapons and autonomous weapon systems. She has previously worked for the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and for international NGOs, and she is particularly focused to work on empowering grassroots activists, especially women and children, to find their voices and become their own human rights defenders. Peter Pove assumed the office of Director of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs at the World Council of Churches in 2014, and has responsibility for the World Council of Churches programmes in the fields of peace building, disarmament and human rights. He's a lawyer by profession and has more than 20 years experience representing church-based organisations in the international policy arena, including prior to his current role for more than 12 years as Assistant Secretary, General Secretary for International Affairs and Human Rights at the Lutheran World Federation, and 4 years as Executive Director of the Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance. I believe, Peter, you're going first. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to everybody for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to be able to engage with real people in our constituency rather than just tapping away at a computer screen. So thank you for that privilege. I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share my screen. It worked just before, so it should work again. There we go. Does that everybody see that? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So there you see my full title, Director of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, but I just use Director International Affairs for short. It's much easier that way. And I'm going to enter into this topic by presenting it in the wider framework of our peace-building agenda, historically and currently. First of all, it's important to capture some of the history. Though the WCC had been conceived of already as early as 1910 or even earlier, its eventual establishment in the 1946-1948 period was both catalyzed and marked by the unprecedented atrocities, suffering, and destruction of the Second World War. It's therefore no surprise that some of the WCC's first engagements were in international affairs, more so than in theological or ecumenical dialogue matters. So, for example, the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, the commission for which I'm responsible, was already established in 1946, 2 years in advance of the WCC itself, and began immediately getting involved in the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as one of its first engagements on behalf of the Global Fellowship of Churches. And then at the first assembly, the official founding of the WCC in 1948 in Amsterdam, the theme that was adopted for that assembly was man's disorder and God's design. And that's, of course, very apposite given the chaotic state of post-war conditions so evident all around in the European arena at that time. And the outcomes of the assembly included the emblematic assertion that war is contrary to the will of God. And that's a statement that we've had occasion to reiterate in recent times. WCC's subsequent history of engagement for peace, justice, and cooperation in the world was crystallized, I think, in the International Ecumenical Peace Convocation held in Kingston, Jamaica in May 2011, which was convened as a harvest festival following the Ecumenical Decade to Overcome Violence from 2001 to 2010. The ecumenical call to just peace, which emerged from this harvest, sought to reorient the discourse surrounding just war and defined 4 dimensions of an inclusive vision of just peace. Just peace in the community, just peace with the earth, just peace in the marketplace, and just peace among the nations. This vision was carried forward by the WCC's 10th Assembly in Busan in 2013 in the Assembly's Statement on the Way of Just Peace. At Busan, the Assembly declared a pilgrimage of justice and peace, which has been the concept under which the entire WCC operated since that time, up to our most recent assembly in Karlsruhe in September last year. Now, though this concept has guided every area of WCC's work during this period, and the work for peace is not separate from the work for human rights or racial and gender justice or climate action or economic justice or health and healing or interreligious dialogue and cooperation or theological education for that matter, WCC has also engaged concretely in specific conflict-affected and conflict risk situations, including the Korean Peninsula, South Sudan, Sudan, Cameroon, Ethiopia, Colombia, Iraq, Syria, Israel, Palestine, West Papua, and Ukraine, most recently. But if I were to start talking about even a couple of those in any more detail, I would use up all the time available today. So I'm just going to mention the places and move on. At the 11th Assembly in Karlsruhe, Germany in September last year, the WCC's pilgrimage was renewed as a pilgrimage of justice, reconciliation, and unity, and a very significant statement on the things that make for peace, moving the world to reconciliation and unity, was adopted. Now, some of the important, I really commend that entire statement to you. It's really a nice distillation of ecumenical thinking on the challenges of peacemaking in the current context. It's worth reading the whole thing. But I want to lift up in the next 3 slides some specific elements that might be of interest to you. First of all, this statement reasserts the ecumenical movement's rejection. And in what I think is a very nice phrase, it says, the calling to dialogue, encounter, and the pursuit of mutual understanding is the very essence of ecumenism and central to peacemaking. The statement recognized the urgent need for a deep, renewed dialogue within the ecumenical movement on the implications of our Christian faith for our witness for peace in the world and for our ecumenical commitment to the way of just peace, and urged the WCC to exercise leadership in cooperation with others to convene dialogue on this. It strongly affirmed the commitment of the WCC and its member churches to peacemaking through interreligious dialogue and cooperation. It rejected the polarization and division of the human community and declared the ecumenical movement's commitment to stay together as an ecumenical fellowship and to grapple with the threats and challenges to peace, to justice, human security, and environmental sustainability of mutual understanding and cooperation, rather than through exclusion and confrontation. It also appealed for much greater financial and practical support by the international community for peace building and peacemaking, rather than for division and military confrontation. And it underlined the important role of women and youth as peacemakers and of non-violent conflict transformation. The statement also called for a global ceasefire, which was reiterating a statement, a call that had been issued by the UN Secretary General. It called for a global ceasefire as an urgent moral imperative in all armed conflicts around the world, and for parties to such conflicts to engage and persist in dialogue and negotiations until just and sustainable peace can be achieved. It also highlighted the negative effects of international sanctions, which we observe in practice in many contexts around the world. In fact, it's increasingly difficult to find a case in which international sanctions have not had a greater negative effect than a positive one. It called for the signature and ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, about which I will say more, as well as calling for full implementation of other disarmament conventions, notably the Arms Trade Treaty, the Landmine Ban Treaty, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and others. It lifted up also the need for a deep Christian ethical reflection on the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, and whether we as Christians can really subscribe to a doctrine that implies that nuclear weapons could be used on our behalf to destroy entire cities with their entire populations and their environments. And it called also for a global preemptive ban on autonomous weapons systems, about which Jennifer will say much more. The statement also called for a moratorium and ultimately an end to the export of the weapons and armaments that fuel conflicts around the world. It demanded full legal accountability for all perpetrators of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. It called for greatly increased investment by governments and other actors in the foundations of true human security and global stability, including for urgent action to achieve climate justice and to avert the threat of catastrophic climate change, and for a just transition to renewable energy. For the elimination of extreme poverty, equality, including through tax justice and reparations, all of which, if not addressed, will fuel conflict. It called also for a new international harm reduction policy to replace the war against drugs, military and paradigm and criminalization approach. And it called for strengthening the capacity of churches around the world for psychosocial counseling and support, especially in conflict-affected settings. So you can see that it brought together a whole range of issues that are relevant to the issue, though it's challenge of peace, sustainable peace in the world, going far beyond the absence of conflict. A number of these issues were also encompassed in a very recent submission that the WCC made for the UN's new agenda for peace, which is still in the process of formulation and updating the United Nations system's approach to peace in a new context where there are so many, as it is often said, converging global crises. Now let me come specifically to the issue of disarmament and nuclear weapons as a segue to what Jennifer will talk about. WCC has been active in advocacy on many different aspects of the disarmament agenda over the years, including the Arms Trade Treaty, small arms and light weapons, landmines, cluster munitions, and most recently, autonomous weapon systems, the killer robots that I referred to earlier. But a special focus has been given to the most indiscriminately and catastrophically destructive weapons ever developed by human beings, nuclear weapons. The first WCC assembly, which took place just 3 years after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, said that the indiscriminately destructive power of atomic weapons is, quote, a sin against God and a degradation of man, unquote. In the 1960s, the WCC urged governments never to contemplate first use of nuclear weapons and to move away from a balance of terror. At the 6th Assembly in Vancouver in 1983, the WCC called already then for a treaty to prohibit the use and possession of nuclear weapons. And since then, that call has been realized because WCC has been an active participant in the international campaign for the abolition of nuclear weapons, ICAN, and in advocacy for nuclear disarmament negotiations to be founded on recognition of the humanitarian consequences of these weapons, and not solely on their military and strategic significance. That is the basis on which we lobbied for a mandate for the drafting of a new nuclear ban treaty, participated in negotiations on the text of the treaty, and advocated for the signature and ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which came into force on the 22nd of January 2021, and which currently has 92 signatories and 68 states parties. So we are moving towards, hopefully, a majority of the states of the world being states parties to this instrument. Despite the recalcitrance of nuclear weapon and nuclear umbrella states, many of whom I doubt will ever sign this treaty, the TPNW has already established a new normative principle in international law that delegitimizes the development, testing, production, possession, use, or threatening to use nuclear weapons by any state. It also, for the first time, establishes obligations for victim assistance and environmental remediation, which had not been addressed in any previous nuclear disarmament treaty. Today, with renewed explicit threats of the use of nuclear weapons in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but also with renewed confrontation and provocation on the Korean Peninsula, the spectre of nuclear war is very much back in the public consciousness. But instead of retreating reflexively into the false security of nuclear deterrence, it is a moment in which we as Christians should really be interrogating our own acquiescence to the doctrine of nuclear deterrence from the perspective of our fundamental faith convictions. So what next on the pilgrimage of justice, reconciliation, and unity? This has been described and launched in a context of what is increasingly called polycrisis, converging global crises of climate change, the lingering impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, economic instability, and conflict. It is, however, a moment in which to recall and implement the 4 dimensions of the way of just peace, which, taken together, constitute a more sustainable framework, in our view, for addressing these challenges. And particularly now in a context where we've had some of our expectations of what we thought were common perspectives within the ecumenical movement challenged by the statements from some church leaders related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there really is a need for deep, renewed dialogue on the implications of our Christian faith, for our witness for peace in the world, and for our ecumenical commitment to the way of just peace. So that's my opening, and I hope it provides a good launching pad, though the metaphor is perhaps awkward, for my colleague Jennifer to also speak to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Rebecca, were you wanting to take questions for Peter at this point, or not until afterwards?
No, so we're going to wait for the plenary.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I will then, are you able to put up my presentation?
Yeah. Hope this is yours.
It should start with a, yeah, perfect.
Yeah, perfect.
Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Yeah. I think if you go to the slideshow button and then from the beginning, it'll just give you one slide at a time. Yeah. That's it. So okay, well, I'll try to pick up where Peter has left off. I joined the World Council of Churches in 2017, and it was like such an exciting time, because after all these years of absolutely no progress with nuclear disarmament, that summer enough states had come together, and there was enough consensus to start working on this new treaty to ban nuclear weapons. And both Peter and I were in New York for that historic event in July 2017, when in a space of 3 weeks, the states that were there negotiated this new treaty. They were able to do it so quickly because the only states that were there were the ones who really wanted it to happen. All of the states that have nuclear weapons or rely on what they call the umbrella of protection from nuclear weapons, they were not at that meeting. They were not there to slow things down. So it meant that the treaty was adopted very, very quickly. I have to admit, I felt quite daunted at the time. I had not worked on disarmament before, and I was suddenly in a room with some real human rights, real disarmament experts. And it was sort of like, well, what can I possibly contribute to this cause? What can my contribution be now going forward, now that we've got this new amazing treaty? And I realized quite quickly that this treaty was all about human rights. which is an area that I'm very familiar with as I've worked in human rights for my entire career. Peter had mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is really the starting point for the human rights structure as we know it now. And so looking at that, over the next 20 years after we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was what we call the 9 core human rights treaties were adopted. There's many other instruments and mechanisms, but we have 9 core human rights treaties, none of which mention nuclear weapons. However, there is one treaty, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, if you'd like to go to the next slide, which was adopted in 1966. And in that, Article 6 says that every human being has the inherent right to life. Now, again, this doesn't talk about nuclear weapons. However, the committee, which monitors how well states are doing in their implementation of that covenant, they, from time to time, produce what they call a general comment, which is a sort of an academic piece thinking as to what they believe that these particular rights encompass. And a few years ago, 2019, they issued a general comment on what they actually mean by the right to life. And I won't read it out there, you can see it yourself, but it does talk about the threat or use of weapons of mass destruction. So there is an understanding that nuclear weapons and the threats that they pose are very much part of our structure of international human rights law. So what can we do with this? Well, one of the mechanisms that we have used quite a lot in the World Council of Churches is a mechanism which the Human Rights Council created with its own creation back in 2006, and it's called the Universal Periodic Review. Next slide, please. So this is a mechanism whereby which every single member state in the UN can have all their human rights in their country, and the review takes place once every 5 years. It's a very political process because the review is actually carried out by other governments. But what of interest to us is that civil society, which includes churches, can engage in several aspects of the process. Next slide, please. So there's just a quick glimpse of what the UN looks like in Geneva. If you ever come by Geneva, you must go and have a visit to the UN building there. And the picture at the top is the Human Rights Council room. It's quite a work of art designed by a Spanish architect. And so when that was unveiled in 2016, you've got all this paint and sort of stalactites coming down. And when the conversations get a little too dull, you have to sit and look and hope that none of them fall on your head. But it is really quite something. So when these reviews take place, ahead of that, maybe I'll just go to the next slide. The reviews, 3 documents are compiled to make up the review. One is a national report, which governments will write themselves to say where they believe they've made areas of progress after the last 5 years. Another is written by the UN, which compiles various pieces of information that the UN has about that country over the last 5 years. And the one of interest to us, which I've made in an orange, yellowy orange triangle, is the stakeholder report, which is also written by the UN, but it's a compilation of all the reports, all the information that civil society wants to contribute. So we really do, as far as the documentation is concerned, we really do have an equal place at the table to give our information. So we give information on a wide range of issues. But starting in 2017, we started thinking about, well, how about we start asking states through this process to consider ratifying this new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Next slide, please. So when the reviews take place, only governments can actually speak, but it's usually issues which we in civil society have reported about and then have gone and done some advocacy in Geneva and elsewhere, asking the governments to raise the particular concerns. So regarding the nuclear disarmament, getting this issue into the Human Rights Council, where it was not traditionally really talked about, and just as an example of how international advocacy really sometimes can work, and how much it really is strengthened by the personal relationships that you can make. Back at the end, about a couple of months after the treaty had been adopted, I happened to meet the ambassador of Guatemala. Now, the Latin American countries have really led the way in creating this treaty. It was the ambassador of Costa Rica who was the chair of the process that created the treaty. But I met the ambassador of Guatemala, who I'd known many, many years ago. So we got into a quite casual, off the cuff conversation, because she was quite keen that the Human Rights Council talked more about the Arms Trade Treaty and the Cluster Munitions Treaty. So I said to her, well, what about the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons? And that was the only conversation we had. But less than 6 weeks later, one of the sessions of this Universal Periodic Review took place. 14 countries went through their reviews, and 11 times the representative from the permanent mission of Guatemala took the floor to recommend to that government to ratify the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Some of those countries had already said, no, we don't want anything to do with this treaty. It's not something that we believe the world needs nuclear weapons, basically. And one of these countries that received the recommendation at that time, and is in a bit of a strange situation because it has a history of permanent neutrality, was Switzerland. And Switzerland had said, no, we're not going to ratify this treaty, which was really caused a lot of concern within the Swiss population, because normally, as I say, Switzerland is in a situation of permanent neutrality, but surrounded by NATO countries and wanting to keep its French and British and American friends happy, they had decided not to ratify this. However, the Swiss Parliament has a process whereby after the Universal Periodic Reviews take place, they actually examine the recommendations that have been accepted and rejected. And they got back to the Swiss government and said, well, we think you should be ratifying this treaty. And so this, to this day, this discussion has gone back and forth between Parliament and government, with Parliament pushing the Swiss government to ratify the treaty. So it's been a real example of how this process can make things move at the national level. So since that time, 57 recommendations have now been made in the Human Rights Council, calling on governments to ratify this treaty, mostly led by Latin American governments. Panama, Honduras, Ecuador, and some others have asked the governments to ratify. And sometimes they ask countries that would probably ratify, but just haven't actually got round to it. So sometimes having this push from the Universal Periodic Review can help to complete these administrative procedures. And this is the only process in the entire UN system by which every single country goes through a review, regardless of the status of the particular treaty. Now, I wanted to talk to you about another area where the Human Rights Council has been involved with the issues of nuclear disarmament, and that's with respect to the Marshall Islands. Now, I put this this picture on because I'm sure many people don't even know where the Marshall Islands is. You kind of go as far as you possibly can go from Europe, and then you go a bit further. They really are, from our perspective, in the middle of the world, in the middle of nowhere. Tiny place, and this is what the Americans thought many years ago when they wanted to test nuclear weapons. So from 1946 to 58, the US conducted 67 nuclear test explosions in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, which left a legacy of absolutely devastating environmental and health problems. And then when they left, oh, maybe the next slide, you can see a little bit more of, yes, so that just gives you, the capital Majuro is down in the bottom corner, and the testing was done at the top. You'll see Enewetok, Bikini Atoll, you've probably heard of, and Long Lap. Those were the ones that were particularly affected. The testing was done up there. And when they left, they built a concrete dome on an island in the top, and the Enewetok Atoll. If you go to the next slide. And this was this was a concrete dome under which the radioactive debris was sealed. And so now a combination of the age of this and the rising sea levels mean that this dome is now starting to crack, and there are some serious concerns about the leakage of radioactive waste. So the decision to test nuclear weapons in all affected locations in the Pacific, it wasn't just the Marshall Islands, it was also the Kiribati, where the UK did the testing, Maui Nui, French Polynesia, where the French did the testing. And it's really totally down to human rights violations, discrimination, and racism, because it was based on a racialized hierarchy of civilized and primitive people. And quite simply, the lives of Pacific Islanders were considered to be of less value than those of their colonizers. And even when the risk of harm was acknowledged, it was either dismissed as being unimportant, or comments were made implying that the bodies of primitive people would be better able to withstand the impact of radioactivity. And whilst the language of primitive and civilized might no longer be used, this continuing failure to address the ongoing impacts of the testing demonstrates this ongoing nexus with racial discrimination. And the consequences of this testing have largely remained invisible and unaddressed, while victims continue to suffer from the impacts upon their health and of their descendants, and the degradation of their environment, the pollution of their waters, and very few people have received compensation or adequate assistance for the consequences that they have suffered. So fast forwarding to last September, the government of the Marshall Islands presented a resolution to the Human Rights Council asking for technical cooperation from the UN to assist them in dealing with the legacy of the nuclear testing. They couldn't ask for a resolution that said anything stronger, such as pushing the US to give them more compensation or to clean up the mess, because if the resolution had any stronger language, it would not have passed. This was they knew the most that they could ask for and get the resolution to pass. They reached out to us ahead of the resolution being discussed because of they knew that we were very interested in the links between the human rights work and the disarmament work, and they asked us for our support. Now, this ask came when we were at Karlsruhe at our assembly, and we had a delegation from the Marshall Islands. So we were able to say to them, this is what's happening in Geneva. There is some movement at the international level. What do you think should be reflected in this resolution? And the two things they asked us to convey were the disproportionate effect on women's bodies, which is still happening today, high rates of cancers, high rates of stillbirths, high rates of birth defects, and plus the fact that as civil society, they really didn't know a lot of what was being said about their country outside their borders, and they really wanted to know more about these sort of initiatives. So the resolution did pass with some initial opposition from those states that have nuclear weapons. And if it works, I would love to show the 3 minutes. Do we have time? Yes, the 3 minutes where the representative from the permanent mission of the Marshall Islands spoke about this resolution, because to me, it's it's one of the most moving moments I've ever heard in the Human Rights Council. So if the link works, that would be great.
We had trouble with our emails, didn't we?
Oh, shall I project it then? I can.
Oh, brilliant! Yes, because Peter, you've got it, haven't you?
Okay.
You have to once you've got the link, Peter. You need to scroll to 8 hours and 49 minutes. So you need to go almost the whole way across the screen.
Okay. So bear with me for a second then while I try and find that.
Buenos días.
Good morning.
Okay. I'll just scroll all the way across and you'll get there.
Support is
Incorporating different views and we have much to learn. On behalf of a core group of Pacific.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen.
Namely Marshall Islands, Nauru, Samoa, Vanuatu, and my own country, Fiji. I have the honor to present the draft resolution.
Okay, go about 4 minutes further on.
Technical assistance and capacity building to address the human rights implications
in the international community.
There you go.
Just how much we have suffered because of the 67 known nuclear tests on our islands. While under a UN trusteeship, our population was misled, our territory abused, and the power to object to these tests was taken away from us. We have also heard from members of this council that the matter has been resolved. We, the people of the Marshall Islands, are still suffering, and we continue to contest this issue. As the premier international body mandated to promote and protect human rights, this council speaks up for the human rights of all persons. It is not a court of law, and such legalistic take on settlements has no place here in our view. The issue before this council is straightforward and unambiguous. We put to you the dire human rights situation of a people whose only land was pulverized and with nuclear waste left behind. This legacy is beyond our capacity, and we need technical assistance to help overcome the challenges and barriers to the full realization and enjoyment of the human rights of our people. As a representative of the Marshall Islands, I affirm that this request is genuine, that the people of the Marshall Islands need this assistance. Excuse me. We have suffered the cancer of the nuclear legacy for far too long. We need to find a way forward to a better future for our people. This has taken too much from us. As we present this resolution, my ambassador, Her Excellency, Madame de Broom, who has been away from her post for some time to deal with personal matters, had just laid her daughter to rest back home, following a brave battle with cancer. She also laid her mother to rest last year because of cancer. And a few years before that, she laid her father to rest again because of cancer. All told, she has lost a total of four of her immediate family members, one after the other, to cancer. A non-communicable disease unknown to our shores prior to the 67 known nuclear weapons that were tested on our islands. Ambassador de Broom is one drop in the sea of struggle and human rights challenges that we face. The people of the Marshall Islands need this council's assistance, and through this resolution, we are requesting this assistance. We therefore implore upon this council to adopt this resolution by consensus and to stand with the people of the Marshall Islands in our efforts to overcome the human rights challenges and barriers arising from our nuclear legacy. Komoltada, and I thank you, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so that says it all, and it's not often that you hear sort of such an emotive speech coming from a government. Often in the Human Rights Council, we will hear the human rights defenders, the human rights victims speaking, and the government's saying yes, everything's fine. But that's really a situation where there's not much difference between the government, the civil society. Everybody is suffering in that country, and it was a really powerful moment. So so just quickly to finish off on the nuclear disarmament. So what we hope to do now is to be part of the follow-up and the implementation of that resolution by taking a small delegation to the Marshall Islands in November. Our former vice moderator of our Central Committee, Bishop Marianne Svensson from the US, has been very, very involved and concerned about the issue of the legacy of nuclear testing by the US, and she will lead our delegation. We will go to, we hope, to at least 2 different atolls where displaced people have moved to after the testing, lived there in the years since. We will talk to them, we will hear from them, and we hope that our feedback and what they tell us will be formed into the report that will go to the Human Rights Council as they plan the next steps as to how to best support the government. So that's on the nuclear disarmament stuff. Moving to our other key issue that we work on, killer robots. What are killer robots? Also known as sometimes known as lethal autonomous weapon systems, but we now try to not use the word lethal autonomous weapon systems, because whether or not they kill shouldn't be the defining factor. Even if they injure, maim, and destroy, they're also something that we want to ban. And so the concern about these machines would be that they would be able to attack targets without meaningful human control. So then the questions will be, well, don't these already exist? Possibly. We know that armed drones do exist and they're in use, but to the best of our knowledge, these still have a human operator controlling the weapon system from a distance, who is responsible for selecting and identifying the targets, as well as pulling the trigger. So to the best of our knowledge, fully autonomous weapon systems, i.e. where a weapon is deciding whether or not to attack, have not yet been deployed, but they probably are out there. They probably have been developed. There are certainly systems which exist, which could be adapted just a little bit further to remove this meaningful human from control from the selection and attacking of targets. If we go to the next couple of slides. So this is a weapon that is used on the border between North and South Korea, armed with a machine gun and a grenade launcher, which can detect human beings using infrared sensors. So it wouldn't take much for that to be fully autonomous. Next one. Next slide, please. So yes, this, to the best of the knowledge of the campaign to stop killer robots, this is a weapon which is under development, an unmanned stealth combat aircraft. And the next one, please. And also under development, a self-navigating warship from the US, which will be designed to hunt for enemy submarines and could operate without contact with with a human operator for 2 to 3 months. So what are the legal arguments against these things? Well, we have laws of war which govern the use of weapons on the battlefield, and killer robots operating without meaningful human control, they would face particular difficulties in complying with fundamental rules of international humanitarian law. For example, can warring parties distinguish between civilians and soldiers? A weapon that can't make such distinction couldn't fulfill that part of international law. Laws of war also require warring parties to weigh the proportionality of an attack, i.e. would the expected harm to civilians and civilian objects be excessive in relation to the expected military advantage? Killer robots could not replace human judgment. There are also concerns about under international human rights law, for example, the right to life. Under human rights law, killing is only lawful when it's necessary to protect human life, or it constitutes a last resort and is applied in a manner proportionate to the threat. So killer robots couldn't make that judgment. The principle of human dignity, which underpins human rights law, and so delegating life or death decisions to machines that cannot fully appreciate the value of human life would undermine human dignity. And then finally, accountability. Victims of human rights abuses have a right to a remedy. So who would be accountable? If you want to use go to the next slide. Would it be the operators of the machines? Would it be the commanders? Next slide. Would it be the manufacturers, or would it be the programmers? There's so many questions that we don't have answers to. And finally, the next slide, please. And who would be the victims? As always, it would be the ones that can't run, the poorest, the weak, the vulnerable, those that can't move out of their areas and go and live somewhere else. So in 2019, the Executive Committee of the World Council of Churches adopted a minute which affirmed our concerns about the ethical, moral and legal implications which would come with the development and deployment of fully autonomous weapons. And they requested that WCC joins the campaign to stop killer robots. And you've seen the things that make for peace statement, which Peter shared earlier, which included an expression of concern from the Assembly about killer robots. The UK's position on these machines is that the government has said that they've repeatedly said we do need standards to govern artificial intelligence and autonomous weapon systems, but they will not commit to the development of an international regulatory framework. And so this is where we are in the processes in Geneva, where we get involved in the negotiations by making statements on our position. A lot of states are saying, yes, these things need to be regulated, but they don't want to see a global ban. They say that governments can self-regulate. And as we know how well that goes usually. So just very finally, we have drafted a church's guide to killer robots. It's quite a straightforward document, only a few pages, where we've tried to simplify what is a very, very complex matter. Not simplify because people in churches are stupid, but simplify so that people might actually read it. There's a foreword by Bishop Christopher Coxworth of Coventry. And if you put the next slide up. There you go. That's the if you Google that, you'll find that document. So I think that's probably, yeah, I've probably gone well over my time, but thank you very much for inviting me to speak.
Thank you so much, Jennifer and Peter. So what we would like to do now is going into some smaller discussion groups. And then come back for a plenary where we'll have a bit of a Q&A, more of a dialogue with our speakers. I hope that most of you can stay with us. If you can bear with me a few minutes, we're going to put people into smaller groups. I think around 6 people in each group. And the smaller groups are not going to be recorded. Okay, Jennifer and Peter, we wanted to give you the option of having a 20-minute break, or whether you would like to join the discussion. Some people like to join the groups and some people prefer to take a break. What would your preference be?
For my part, I'm happy to join a group if that would be of interest.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Some interesting discussion. So Ashley's got some technical issues at the moment, but I'm hoping that we can just go and have a plenary discussion. If you can raise your hand, that would be really helpful. It can be on video or through the reaction option button. I think what we'd like is some of your questions to the speakers, or thoughts that have occurred over the last 20 minutes. That would be really, really great to hear from you. Richard Seaborn.
I'd like to speak on the outcome of our group, because we had the fortune to have both Nicola and Peter Pove there, so that we had answers as well as questions, which was very helpful. And the general focus was that the essence of getting out of the jams, the geopolitical jams we're in, has to be people to people. It has to be dialogue, and it has to be. Also, yes, I mean, that's why I introduced a no hate and no hate reactions to the actual people in countries in conflict. But a lot of our talk was about the nuclear problem and how nuclear nations are reluctant to engage. They may have signed the non-proliferation treaty, but then reluctant to engage in dialogue, and at UN or WCC situations, they tend to be sort of absent. And again, the cluster bombs and the autonomous drones. And the other aspect was that because we've got known as what was referred to as polycrisis, because we've got the Ukraine situation, which is so polarizing, we lose sight of other areas where dialogue is still equally needed. I think I'll pause at that point.
Thank you, Richard.
I think there's more to it simply than losing sight of other areas of dialogue. It's simply the sense in which all these things intermesh. You know, so it's we tend to get into a situation where we regard a particular issue as being a discrete issue, which can be dealt with discreetly. But in reality, that is not the case, because, as I say, you've got all these things going on at the same time, all of which are intimately, in reality, related to each other.
Peter?
Yes, first of all, I just want to thank our rapporteur, it's Richard, isn't it, for his very good summary of some of the points of our conversation, but also to affirm what Keith just said, that the interconnectedness of these converging crises all at once is the key challenge. And it's exactly the reason why the UN is now trying to articulate a new agenda for peace in an age of converging crises. A new agenda that takes into account all these interconnections that cannot be discretely put into different silos because they do interconnect. But having said that, I also think that one of the, among the many, many, many tragedies of the Ukraine conflict is that precisely at the moment, when the world really just has a few more years to come together and to confront the global existential challenge of climate change, precisely at that moment, we have the emergence of a conflict that not only prevents that coming together, but deepens the divisions between us and makes the challenge of a common global response to the threat, the common threat of climate change, even less likely. That's a real tragedy.
David?
Another point that came up in the group where we were lucky to have Peter with us. If Peter said, I wonder if it's as bad as that, then most of the hotlines, East-West hotlines, have been suspended. I suspect one should not be too pessimistic about that. I think probably there are some, but if Peter's right that most of the hotlines have been suspended, then that we really are in a very worrying situation. But maybe Peter might like to say a word for a general discussion at some point on this one.
Yeah, that was an observation that was made to me by the Swiss ambassador in Geneva, quite an experienced diplomat. And he was lamenting the fact that there is now, in the current context, much less day-to-day professional diplomatic encounter between the West and Russia than there was even at the height of the Cold War. And so the absence of dialogue, the absence of communication is always a threat amplifier. If you're not in communication with your adversary, if you're not at least seeking to engage to keep open diplomatic channels of dialogue, you're in trouble. The risks are exacerbated.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think that if only Putin had been talking to somebody before he started his military operation, if he'd been talking, because he apparently said one of the reasons he wanted to do what he did was because of all the Russian people who were in Ukrainian territory. That's what he said. If he'd come to a table and talked about that, perhaps this could have been sorted. Perhaps this could have been sorted out before. So if we'd had jaw before World War, it would have been much better all round. But it didn't happen, and that goes on to some of the things that we discussed, I suppose. Yeah, in our group. We didn't discuss that point, but perhaps I'm being a little bit retrospectively idealistic. I'm sure I am. But it's true, isn't it, that diplomacy and talking to people can lead to resolutions which are acceptable to both sides, because that's what we want them to do now. But things have got very difficult in Ukraine and Russia.
Peter, thank you, Alison.
Yeah. You know, there's always two sides to every story, and I don't want to come across as a Putin apologist, far from it. But the Russian side of the story on this matter is that they did come to the US and to Western Europe with their concerns about NATO expansion in particular. And that their concerns were not heard and were dismissed and were not in any way responded to.
Right.
Now, history will judge the truths of this dispute as to who did what or who didn't do what prior to this conflict exploding. But just to say that there is a Russian side to that story as well.
Yeah.
Hi, just a quick question. Maybe not so quick, but in our group we were kind of not lamenting, but just kind of reflecting on how do you put the genie back in the bottle in terms of these autonomous weapons and autonomous weapon systems, and kind of how do we as a global community do that? And I was wondering whether Peter or could speak on that, just a kind of reflection on that, and whether is it worth putting that energy in that, or I guess I know that's quite a wider question.
Oh, I think the answer to that is basically what we're appealing for: a preemptive ban on the development and deployment of these weapons. But Jennifer, do you want to jump in on that?
Well, yeah, that's it exactly, a preemptive ban. And we're even hearing now that the AI industries are starting to say we need to be regulated, you know, so they are themselves pretty scared of what they are creating. And so the policymakers need to start listening.
And what would you say to those who would say if someone's going to make it anyway? What you would have to have a preemptive ban with 200 and something countries. Just wondering what your response to that would be. Is it kind of generating another norm, like with cluster munitions, with biological and chemical weapons?
I think what we've looked at, we do have an example of a preemptive ban. 20 or so years ago, there were discussions about creating laser blinding weapons. So these wouldn't kill you, they just blind you, which are pretty horrific as well. And the UN, the countries came together and were successful in coming up with a preemptive ban before these weapons came to full fruition. The problem is there's also, like with weapons creation, it's not just the moral side of it, there's a heck of a lot of money in this, the arms industries. I mean, same with the ongoing endless spending on nuclear weapons. And I was going to mention in my presentation, I forgot that we had the report that came out last month, $82 billion was spent by the 9 nuclear weapons countries on upgrading and modernizing their arsenals, which are just absolutely horrific. So it's also just the industry and the money that people are making from these, which is what it's helping them to, or causing them to put the brakes on regulation.
Could I ask or make a point in relation to what Peter said about mutual listening between Russia and the West? I don't know whether anybody saw Channel 4 News last night, where there was a clip of Putin with George W. Bush and other NATO leaders at a point at which Russia had requested to join NATO. It was around 2003, 2004. And Putin said at the meeting, and it was a very convivial meeting, or so it seemed, I hope there's no objection to Russia joining NATO. Well, of course, we know the result of that dialogue, that George Robinson, who was a former Labour minister, who was the chair, told Putin that he had to wait in a queue. I thought that's a rather significant individual anecdote about the state of mutual miscomprehension between West and East. Don't know whether Peter has any comment to make about that.
I can jump in quickly on that. I'm no expert on the history of the period, but many commentators and authorities, including Professor Jeffrey Sachs, if you want to Google some of his writings and his what he's had to say about this issue, I think he's a bit too aggressive and a bit too acerbic, but history does seem to show that there was an opportunity for a different sort of approach to a collective European regional security, for which Russia was willing at that time. And that opportunity was either by design or by accident missed. Now, it's easy to be wise after the event, and there are many different forces that push and pull decision makers at any given point in history. But I think in retrospect, that was a tragic mistake, not to take the opportunity of trying to build a collective European regional security system inclusive of Russia, and not excluding Russia and maintaining an implicit confrontational stance.
Thank you.
Could I take the discussion in a somewhat different direction for a moment? Thinking not about Ukraine and Russia, but about something which struck me when it happened as being actually in a way somewhat parallel to it, and that is the Israeli attack on Jenin and the general treatment of Palestinians by Israel. I live in the Manchester area, and the Anglican Diocese of Manchester is organising, under the leadership of the bishop, a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. My immediate response to this personally was, no way would I conceivably take part in something of that sort, because it would the result would be to put money into the pockets of what I see as a totally illegitimate regime, that is Israel. Now, am I missing a point, particularly when you bear in mind all this thing about the need for dialogue? Now, I don't know how much dialogue is likely to take place with Palestinians or Israelis or whatever during such a pilgrimage. But do people feel that my response to this was an appropriate one or not?
I'm going to defer to Sandra. Sandra, go first.
I am sorry, I arrived late. So, but in terms of this, in part because I arrived late, I rushed to pick up. I don't know if people are familiar with the work of Sabeel and Friends of Sabeel groups, but the Friends of Sabeel in America produced a statement following the issues, particularly in Jenin, And I thought it was very helpful in a Christian response. I won't read the whole of it. I can send it to somebody, probably via Keith. But it says it's not that Christians are required to come up with a magic solution, but they should have a clear and powerful message as to what elements are required for any proper response. And then measure whatever response is given against those. So a rejection of violence and militarism, a commitment to talking to each other, a commitment to justice, fairness, and equality, recognition that we live in a broken, sinful world often means we must champion positions that may be unpopular, run against customary wisdom, or which appear to be unrealistic and utopian. We need to think outside the box and offer people a vision of peace with justice that runs counter to existing unjust realities. We must resist the despair and hopelessness that allows the unjust status quo to continue. And in terms, I had this sort of discussion about visits to Holy Land at a Sacre meeting, that's schools, last night, where there was a proposal from one teacher that they were going to have such a visit. And there are guidelines about how to do this so that you can have dialogue.
Yeah.
Lots of people will help you organise. Amos Trust for one. I think Sabile, or what it now is, but I heard a talk the other week by people from the Tent of Nations, and I'd suggest you look that up if you're not familiar with it. People who live in caves because they're not allowed by the Israelis to continue to develop their farm, but they have developed their farm and have visits and so on. And their strap line is we refuse to be enemies. And I just think actually there's a lot going on in the situation there that could help guide us, but also in terms of the general theme. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on quite such at length in response, but the other thought in my mind at this meeting was talking about visits by the army to schools and the need for some sort of counter things. But it struck me that we tell our children they must not carry knives. This will lead to more violence.
Yeah.
And yet what do they see adults doing but arming themselves to the hilt, supposedly as deterrence or self-defense? Sorry, that's all I want to say.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Can I briefly speak before Peter? The Ecumenical Accompaniment Programme for Palestine and Israel, EAPPI, is run by the Quakers, but is ecumenical, and that does have Arab-Israeli dialogue. I think one of the problems is that the Arabs have not been good at providing spokespersons who are, as it were, approachable and helpful. But that is a situation where it shows that dialogue can be achieved.
Mm.
Yes, Richard has stolen my thunder, but it's just as well. No, Keith, listen, I hear you and I understand, but I would never exclude the possibility of dialogue. I think it's always a good antidote for divisions and confrontation. I think we also have to very carefully make a distinction between Israel as a state and as a nation and a particular government or governments. From our point of view, there have been successive governments in Israel who have done very bad things from a Palestinian point of view. And for the WCC, it is natural that we should be particularly strong in our solidarity with the Palestinian communities, because that is our constituency in the region, Christian Palestinians. And this is what I always have to explain to our Jewish partners, that, our first responsibility as a membership organization is to speak on behalf of our constituency and their experiences. Having said that, and it's true that, the ecumenical accompaniment program operated at the international level by the World Council of Churches and in the UK through the Quakers has had a 20-year history of living with and monitoring the situation and reporting on the situation as experienced by Palestinian communities in the occupied territories of the West Bank. And this has made us quite a target of both successive Israeli governments, but also of Jewish groups. And we have been regularly and are still sometimes accused of being fundamentally anti-Semitic. We went through a painful process over recent years of re-establishing a relationship with IJKIC, with the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultation, who were very critical of us and of our positions. But I think that process and that investment of time and emotion has been worth it. I think that they have helped us in many ways avoid unnecessary conflicts, often about the use of language, and to focus on the necessary conflicts over specific policy issues. They've also helped us to engage with what they call the normative Jewish-Israeli perspective on the situation, and to broaden our points of reference beyond the Palestinian perspective, but to be more inclusive of the broader reality in the region. I think this has been of considerable benefit to us. So short answer is, I would never say no as a matter of principle to the idea of a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, but I would encourage you to make sure that that's done in close partnership with entities like EAPPI and like some of the other partners that have been mentioned, who can also bring into that program a direct exposure to the lived experience of Palestinians and not just to the Holy Land, Disneyland type experience of just visiting the holy sites, bereft of any encounter with the political and social reality in the region.
Thank you, Peter. We heard from Judith and then Dorothy.
I just wanted to talk a bit about Palestine. We were there for a retreat study tour there in 2016, and we had a lot of contact with Jewish people who were involved in things like Israelis against housing demolition and so on. There are a lot of Jewish organizations who are against what the Israeli government is doing, and it's worth making contact with those. But it's also an issue that is about the interconnected things that's been talked about before, the interconnectedness. For example, we're involved with an Iranian charity which is trying to mitigate the harm that the Iranian government is doing at a government level, appalling things to their people. And when I said, but what about what's going on in Palestine, their answer was, if the power of this particular government in Iran was stopped in some way, preferably by a change of government, most of the problems in the Middle East would disappear, because they're fomenting chaos wherever they take part in this international.
Thank you, Judith. Dorothy?
Well, first I'd advise Keith to go if he can. And I'm sure it's what you would have to say to the other people in your group who are having dialogue with them will be a start, because you've got a very wide knowledge already of those experiences. And but what I really wanted to say was in connection again with dialogue, because after Lukashenko was non-re-elected in 2020, I spoke to my friend in Belarus pretty well every week, because they weren't able to have any, the children of Chernobyl weren't able to come and visit us anymore. And there was a general feeling of bereftness. But since last Christmas, I haven't spoken to her at all. And the one contact she made, the director of our charity told me she was in great danger just making that contact with us, because her husband was likely as someone who hardly showed any, he didn't demonstrate or anything, except that he was headmaster of a school. And the whole thing, just wanted to say, the people there are so fearful, and we can't, dialogue was so important to be able to talk to them. And now that normal everyday dialogue, and the same with all the people, we've had over 100 families over the time come to Malvern, and yet we can't really, with any comfort from our side to their, initiate any conversations with them at the moment. And I think that in the run of things, hotlines, of course, are very, very important, but so is ordinary contact people to people. And that has meant such a lot to them over the years. And I just wanted to put that in.
But could I just say that I'm very grateful to those who have made various responses to what I said. I know it's been quite brilliant. Thanks.
May I just add one thing? Some of you probably know, have known Helen Hutchison, who is a very good friend of mine. And it was through her I became very interested in the work of faith in Europe. She contacted me recently, it may have been about a month ago, saying, had I heard from Keck, with whom we've both had dealings over the years, in different capacities, that they had started an initiative, or trying to get it off the ground, for young people in the West to write to young people in Russia, or to get Ukrainians to write, young people to write from one to the other. But I don't know the results of that yet. It's a nice thought, but from what Dorothy has just said, sometimes these things can prove very difficult, but we shouldn't give up.
Thanks, Alison. Sandra?
It's a question going back to nuclear. I was with people, well, I was talking to someone from the Democratic Republic of Congo yesterday in connection with, I mean, there are conflicts there that hardly anybody hears about. That's another side of all this. But it's linked very often to minerals. And what they were saying, and I hadn't known, was that it was uranium from the DRC, which was in the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think in connection with anything nuclear, bombs or weaponry or power, this is a side that is often forgotten, that it does need the mining of certain minerals. And what are the mineral, what nations are involved in the production of minerals, and are they involved in any of the consultations and dialogue?
Is that something you could respond to, Jennifer?
Yes, this is very much an issue which, again, the extractive companies would prefer that we don't talk about, and the nations that are involved in this would prefer that we don't talk about. But it just adds to the ongoing misery of the people of the Democratic Republic of Congo having their minerals extracted for all our mobile phones, for our cars, and for nuclear weapons. Yes, it's something that is talked about, but not talked about enough. In the Human Rights Council, it does come up under the issue of business and human rights, and there's various discussions under that, and the Business and Human Rights Forum. But it's certainly something that we need to keep continually putting the spotlight on. And slightly in connection with that, where we have seen some traction is actually with the finance institutions, because even though many of the states have said we're not going to touch this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and certainly the nuclear ones don't, banks in those countries are actually starting to realize that there is now a normative, a new norm against changing the morality around nuclear weapons, and they are starting to think, we're not so sure we want to be associated with that. And there's an annual report from Pax International called "Don't Bank on the Bomb," which actually lists all the financial institutions which are banking or are banking on or giving money towards for nuclear weapons technology. So it's worth looking at that and seeing if your bank is one of these, or your insurance or company is listed. Write them a letter and say, because we have the precedent of in the US, the continuing use of the death penalty. Well, that got harder for them when pharmacies didn't want to supply them with the materials for lethal weapons, for lethal injections anymore. And now let's see if we can have a similar precedent and have banks starting to pull out of funding nuclear weapons technologies. But it's only going to come if people who are putting their money in those banks start either writing to these banks and saying we're not going to do it anymore, or pulling out of banking with them entirely.
Can I check if Ashley Beck, if your audio is functioning now?
Yes.
Okay, brilliant.
Yes, I'm all right now.
Great. I think we'll probably be wrapping up in a few minutes. Is there any other kind of comments or questions anyone would like to raise before we come to a close?
Can I just mention one more thing? We did discuss this in our group. Human rights as observed in our own country, in the UK. Andrew mentioned that earlier on, and I'm very concerned to think that United Kingdom after Brexit will possibly want to withdraw from the European dimension. I'm not exactly sure it's called, I'm sorry, but we were part of it and we're still part of it technically. And Brexiteers have talked about Britain somehow setting up its own human rights legislation, and we know why it is. It's all to do with migrants and so on. But it's very concerning if the present government goes ahead with that, I think. I don't know what other people think about that.
David?
Yes, the European Convention of Human Rights is linked to the creation of the Council of Europe, where Britain had a leading role after the war. And this, fortunately, is a European structure with it, where Britain is still a member, although some on the government side are saying that we should pull out of the Council of Europe and the Convention of Human Rights as well. This is certainly something we need to continue to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you.
Judith?
I heard that the government had ceased to promote pulling out of the European Convention on Human
that's
Rights.
good news.
That's what I've heard. I'm going to say something else, but it's gone.
Can I make a very general comment? And that is that there seems to be a persistent belief that the only way to achieve anything of value is by force. And what we have said consistently throughout the course of this afternoon is that that's the last way you're ever going to achieve anything. But whatever, you know, I mean, we talk about dialogue, that is the absolute opposite of achieving one's own view of what is right by force.
Peter?
I responded to a direct question from one of the participants, not to all of you, but asking about, whether the WCC engages in advocacy for direct and complete or full and complete disarmament, which we don't. We've tended to focus on specific weapons systems and the arms trade over recent years, at least. However, I also made the comment in my response to that participant that I would have to say that in recent years, or during the period that I've been working with the WCC, we have definitely been tending towards more of a pacifist orientation. That there hasn't been a single case during this period of years where WCC has even grudgingly admitted the necessity of armed force to achieve a particular purpose. So we are not yet officially a pacifist organization, but it seems to me that the policy trajectory that the WCC has been on is definitely heading in that direction. But at this point, we still leave open the at least theoretical possibility that in some cases the use of force is a necessary evil. Maybe what is happening in Ukraine now and the support provided to Ukraine, at least for defensive purposes, is a case in point. But I think the tendency over WCC policy positions over the years is fairly clearly in that direction. It'll be interesting to see how things play out in the next years. And apropos of nothing, I just want to mention that one particularly hopeful experience that I often quote is that one of the youth members of our now past, previous generation of the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs, he was sort of shoehorned into the role because we didn't have enough youth. So he was a young man from Uruguay who was very apologetic when he found himself appointed to our commission. He said to me, "Look, I'm very sorry, I have really no relevant experience. I've studied engineering. I'm about to start my first job as an engineer. I really don't know what I can contribute to this commission." But this young man, single-handedly, as far as I know, secured the ratification of the government of Uruguay to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So to me, this illustrates the power of one, as the title of the book was. A committed person in the right place and what they can achieve.
Yeah, it's good news.
I think that's probably a good place to finish. Thank you so much to everybody for being with us and to our speakers. Thank you so much. Our next briefing is going to be the 14th of September. It's looking to be on European challenges from Christian youth leader perspectives. We're still finalising details on this one, but we'll be in touch in the next 6 weeks with some more information. I'll hand over to Ashley.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. My connection's not very good. Many thanks to the speakers. And the last piece of news from Peter was something to lift our spirits a bit, because a lot of what we've had to think about has been rather depressing. But the hope is in young people, both for the world and for faith in Europe. Many thanks to Rebecca for doing all the work, and to our colleagues at CTBI. And we hope to see you in September, and have a good summer. God bless and take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.